Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new edition of Africa Today, where we get you the latest news and events taking place on the African scene. And we will start off with our major top stories and reports. France is to declassify secret colonial era documents on Algeria war. IMF says Sudan made tangible progress forward, establishing strong reform implementation. More details in the following report.
Macron has announced a decision to speed up the declassification of secret documents related to Algeria's 1954 to 1962 War of Independence from France. The measures come as part of efforts to speed up access for researchers to the documents and as France reportedly aims to tackle its colonial past. The French presidency said in a statement that archive services will now be allowed to use a new procedure to declassify documents from 1970 and earlier that were previously being held secret for national security purposes. Under French laws, almost all archives of the French state, including on defense and security issues, should be made available to the public after 50 years except information that could compromise some people's security. Yet a complex and long request process was preventing researchers and academics from working on these archives. In 2018, Macron formally recognized the responsibility of the French state in the 1957 death of a dissident in Algeria, Maurice Audin, admitting for the first time the French military's use of systematic torture during the war. Last week, Macron met with 4 grandchildren of an Algerian independence fighter to tell them that Ali Boumendjel had been tortured and killed by French soldiers in 1957.
And still with our special reports, the International Monetary Fund has approved the first review of Sudan's staff monitored program, which supports the government's homegrown program of reforms. More details in this report.
The International Monetary Fund IMF Managing Director approved the first review of Sudan's Staff Monitored Program SMP. The SMP reportedly supports the government's homegrown program of reforms aimed at stabilizing the economy, strengthening social protection, boosting the private sector, and strengthening governance. A statement by the IMF reported the approval on Monday and said, the Sudanese authorities have made tangible progress towards establishing a strong track record of policy and reform implementation, a key requirement for eventual debt relief. The IMF stressed the exchange rate unification, removal of fuel subsidies, tax measures taken as part of the 2021 budget, and increase in electricity tariffs. The fund said it believes these will reduce distortions in the economy and facilitate fiscal consolidation, as well as help bring down the current high rate of inflation and create fiscal space for social spending. It suggested a reform of the customs exchange rate to lift revenue and competitiveness and avoid a return to distortionary policy measures, including multiple currency practices and fiscal subsidies.
Moving on to Kenya and our feature report that rhinos, female northern white rhinos, Fatu and Najin, are the last 2 northern white rhinos on the planet, and scientists are racing to save their species. More in this report.
Scientists around the world are now in a race against time to save the species at the Ol Pejeta Conservancy in Laikipia in Kenya. Their keepers say that having the last 2 northern white rhino is a clear symbol of what extinction means, and because these animals are not able to speak for themselves, scientists must act as their voice. The plan is to use cells harvested by the 2 females and others collected from male northern whites saved before they died. The embryos will be fertilized artificially and then implanted into a surrogate southern white rhino. Last year, 3 embryos were successfully created despite the coronavirus pandemic causing delays. but for the moment, implant embryos are still being tested in Europe. It's an international effort led by the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin, Germany, Avantea Biotechnology Research and Animal Reproduction Lab in Cremona, Italy, Dvor Kralov Zoo in the Czech Republic, and the Olpejita Conservancy and the Kenya Wildlife Service. The procedure to create viable embryos has proven to be safe and can be performed regularly before the two females become too old. For those involved in the effort, acutely aware of time, delays caused by the pandemic are all the more painful. Decades of poaching have taken a heavy toll on rhinos, as their tusks are used for carving material and prized in traditional Chinese medicine for their supposed healing properties. But it is hoped technology and science can give the northern white rhino another shot at life.
Welcome back, dear viewers, and we're glad to be joined over the phone by Dr. Basant Fahmi, economic analyst. Good afternoon, Dr. Basant. Dr. Basant?
Yes, yes.
Good afternoon, Dr. Basant. Talking on economic challenges facing the African continent, in your opinion, what are the most important challenges facing the continent these days in light of the coronavirus pandemic and the recent developments that are taking place in the African continent?
Well, the most crucial point, first of all, is corruption. Second, which is a very important one as well, is the interfight between the countries and interfights and problems within the same country. Mm-hmm. Third, disclosure, transparency, the way you manage the economy. Fourth, the banking system. You have to have a proper banking system and a proper stock market, because you can't do economic development without having those two. Mm-hmm. Third, they need to have in place laws and regulations like what we have done in Egypt. Egypt has a very good experience and story to tell the African countries and to help them develop. Right. Moreover, the terrorism as well is really something which is becoming intolerable. And the other point as well, I don't know what number it is the number of young generation. That young generation needs attention. They need education, they need health care, they need proper way to live, they need good jobs. The list is very long but doable, meaning the Egyptian experience, I repeat, is there and we can help them a lot. Meaning, first of all, we need to develop or to divide the African continent into economic regions. Mm-hmm. That's number one. Number two, to develop or an atmosphere who could encourage the countries and the major cross-border finance companies to come to Africa with their technology. Third, the finance is the easiest part, but you need to restructure Africa. So I repeat, regions, and then I repeat, you have to fight terrorism, you have to fight ignorance, healthcare, education. It's true, it is a long list, but I think the Egyptian experience is doable, and we can help them do that. We can help them as well in the banking system. We can help them develop the stock market. Mm-hmm. Because if you want to develop economy, you need to have pillars. Right. And those pillars, unfortunately, do not exist. You need to help them as well to deal with the international world without fear. Mm-hmm. Because now everybody needs everybody. And the economic diplomacy is the language where everybody or everyone is a win-win situation, as you say. Yes. So the way is easy, but it needs a proper system, strategy, and inshallah, Egypt can help a lot in that field.
Right. Well, Dr. Basant, how would you describe the role of the African Union in boosting African economies, specifically during the coronavirus crisis?
It's very important because, first of all, they speak the same language. And I don't mean language, but I mean they understand each other. You cannot bring people or other countries into a region where they don't know the habits and the way people are thinking. So the African Union is very important. It's exactly like when you say the Arab League for the Arab world. We speak the same language, we have the same traditions, we know our problems. So I think they have a very big role to play in the front line. Because I repeat, you cannot bring in people from another world and ask them to change without understanding the logic, the traditions. You see, it's very complicated. So I think, yes, they have a very important role. It doesn't mean the assistance of the international community has to be there as well.
Right. Regarding the African Free Trade Agreement that has been signed, how do you think will it help in promoting inter-African trade and inter-African economies?
It will help, but I want to mention something very important here. We have to implement the strategy of the counter-trade philosophy. The counter-trade philosophy needs multinational banks who could really know how to exchange the products of Africa, not only within Africa, but with the whole world. And let me give you a simple example. If an African country, for instance, has a product X, the counter-trade concept make researches on the globe and see which country on earth needs that X. And in return, they bring in another thing which is this African country needs. So the counter-trade concept is new to the region, but it is extremely important. There are major multinational banks who are known by name, who can come and implement the system, and it will help to accelerate. The free trade agreement is fine, but it is not as effective as the counter-trade system would really play a major role.
Right. Well, Dr. Prasant, you've mentioned corruption. In your opinion, what's the first steps that should be taken to combat corruption?
Listen, corruption exists everywhere, but you need to stop it somewhere, meaning we will never eliminate corruption to zero, but at least it doesn't come to the main sources of the country. Every country has major resources. You cannot have a small look at Lebanon and what is happening in Lebanon, for instance. You need to put a stop and say, well, at that level, corruption will not be accepted, meaning the major resources and wealth of the country, because they are abused by a minimum number of people who takes all the resources and leaves the others behind. So I think corruption has to come from the top to the bottom, not the other way around.
Right. Do you think that the different African states face the same common challenges?
Yes, the whole region, not only the African continent. I mean, why? Because the world has gone into a new era, which is the advancement of technology, the advancement, people are walking now over the moon and Mars, so they are left behind. All those countries, they have the same problem. They have young generation who prefers to die in the sea rather than living in where they live, because they have a telephone in their hand and they can see the whole world. So they say, why live here? I would rather die, but go to the advanced countries. So I think the illegal immigration is not really subject to one country, all of them. So we have to understand the young generation needs to develop and stay where they are. And this can be done by, as I mentioned, the help of major multinational companies. They could come to the region, invest, and here you have to have a climate which could be really attractive and safe, and repeat safe, and at least corruption would go to the minimum level. Otherwise, they will never approach the area.
Right. Well, as you've just mentioned, the role of the new generations, how do you see the role of the youth in the African continent towards sustainable development? What role should they be playing towards their countries?
We are lucky. I repeat, we are lucky to have young generations. There are countries in the world, European countries, which suffer because they don't have young generation. They are all old. They stop getting married, they go on children, and they enjoy life. And now they discover that they don't have young generation to continue rebuilding their economy. So we are lucky. This is an asset. But we need to concentrate on training them, on giving them their rights, and let them enjoy standard of living like what they see on their telephones in the United States and Europe and so on and so forth. But this young generation is a big wealth to those countries. It is not something we should really be unhappy with. On the contrary, but we need to train them, develop them, give them the opportunity. And even if you concentrate on micro projects and small projects and medium, this could really rebuild Africa in a very positive manner.
And how can African countries or the African continent in general boost the bond among African youth in different countries?
First of all, many young of those are really required in other parts of the world. For instance, if you look at Iraq would need people to work infrastructure. Possibly could be part of the African countries. Their young generation could go to Iraq, could go to Syria, could go to Yemen, could go to Libya. They could participate in the region. Moreover, they could, if they are well trained and well educated, they could outside as well. So we need to concentrate on training them, giving them the minimum level of education so that they communicate with the world based on the international standard, not on the African standard, where unfortunately are totally different, especially the corruption side and the bad habits and so on and so forth. So our young generation is big wealth. We need to capitalize on.
Right. Well, I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Bassam Fahmy, our economic analyst, for your insight. And dear viewers, that wraps up this edition of Africa Today. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more coming up here on Nile TV International.